The dollar's 80-year dominance is ending, and when it collapses, most Americans will lose everything overnight. What I'm about to tell you isn't conspiracy theory or doomsday hysteria. This is mathematical inevitability based on debt levels, geopolitical shifts, and currency movements that are happening right now. And if you don't position yourself correctly before this transition accelerates, you're going to watch your purchasing power evaporate while the government tells you everything is fine. I don't care if this sounds impossible or if it challenges everything you've been taught about American financial supremacy. The reserve currency status that has made America wealthy for decades is under attack from every direction, and the attack is working. Countries representing over half the world's population are actively building systems to bypass the dollar. Central banks are dumping U.S. treasuries and hoarding gold at record rates. And the petrodollar system that has forced global oil trade through dollars is cracking under geopolitical pressure. This isn't about politics or patriotism. This is about protecting your wealth from a currency crisis that could make the 1970s inflation look like a minor inconvenience. When reserve currencies collapse, they don't go down slowly. They go down fast, and they take entire generations of savings with them. Ask the British who lived through the pound's collapse after World War II. Ask anyone who held German marks in the 1920s or Argentinian pesos in the 1980s. The difference this time is that the dollar isn't just another currency. It's the foundation of the entire global financial system. When it falls, the shock waves will be felt everywhere. But here's the crucial point. While most people will be devastated by this transition, the people who see it coming and position themselves correctly will not only survive but thrive. Let me walk you through exactly what's happening, why it's accelerating, and what you need to do to protect yourself. This isn't theoretical anymore. The dollar's collapse as the global reserve currency has already begun. The only question is whether you'll be ready when it accelerates. First, let's understand what reserve currency status actually means and why losing it would be catastrophic for most Americans. When a currency is the global reserve, it means that central banks around the world hold it as their primary foreign exchange reserves. International trade gets conducted in it, commodities get priced in it, and most importantly, there's constant global demand for it regardless of the issuing country's economic fundamentals. This creates what economists call an exorbitant privilege. The United States can print dollars, and the rest of the world has to accept them because they need dollars to participate in global trade. We can run massive trade deficits because other countries need to accumulate our currency. We can borrow money at lower interest rates because there's constant demand for dollar-denominated debt. Essentially, we export inflation and import goods. But this privilege comes with a critical vulnerability. If global demand for dollars disappears, if countries stop needing dollars for trade, if central banks start holding other currencies as reserves, then the entire system reverses. Instead of exporting our inflation, we import it. Instead of borrowing cheaply, we face higher interest rates. Instead of running trade deficits, we face the harsh reality that we have to actually produce value to purchase goods from other countries. This reversal is exactly what's happening right now, and it's happening faster than most people realize. The BRICS nations have spent the last decade building alternative financial infrastructure specifically designed to bypass the dollar. China and Russia are conducting massive amounts of trade in their own currencies. India is buying oil from Russia with rupees. Brazil and China are trading directly without using dollars at all. More importantly, these aren't just bilateral arrangements. They're building multilateral systems that could eventually replace the dollar-based system entirely. The BRICS payment system, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, the expansion of currency swap agreements. These are all components of a parallel financial system that doesn't depend on American banks, American clearing systems, or American approval. The numbers are staggering. In 2000, about 70% of global foreign exchange reserves were held in dollars. Today, that figure has dropped to around 60%, and it's falling every year. Central banks are diversifying into euros, yen, yuan, and increasingly gold. They're not doing this because they hate America. They're doing it because they've realized that depending entirely on one country's currency is strategically dangerous. The petrodollar system is under even more direct attack. This system, established in the 1970s, required oil-producing countries to sell their oil in dollars and then invest those dollars in U.S. treasuries. It created artificial demand for dollars and allowed us to finance our deficits by essentially forcing the world to lend us money. But that system is crumbling. Russia is selling oil to China in yuan. Iran is selling oil in currencies other than dollars. Even Saudi Arabia, the cornerstone of the petrodollar system, is discussing accepting other currencies for oil payments. When major oil producers stop requiring dollars, the artificial demand that has supported our currency for 50 years disappears. The debt situation makes all of this worse. The United States has over $30 trillion in federal debt, and that number is growing by trillions every year. Our debt to GDP ratio is approaching levels that have historically led to currency crises in other countries. But those other countries didn't have reserve currency status to protect them. Here's what most people don't understand about currency collapses. They don't happen gradually. They happen in phases, with long periods of stability, followed by sudden dramatic shifts. We're currently in the stability phase, where most people don't notice anything changing. But underneath, the foundations are shifting. When those foundations crack, the collapse phase begins, and it moves very quickly. The British pound provides the perfect historical example. After World War II, Britain was financially exhausted, but the pound remained a major reserve currency through the 1950s and 1960s. British politicians assured their citizens that the pound's status was secure, that Britain remained a global financial power, that the special relationship with America would protect their interests. Then came the Suez Crisis in 1956. The United States opposed British action and threatened to sell U.S. holdings of British bonds, which would have crashed the pound. Britain was forced to withdraw, and the world realized that the pound was no longer independent of American financial pressure. The subsequent decline was rapid and devastating. By the 1970s, the pound had lost most of its international role, and Britain faced severe inflation, currency controls, and economic chaos. The parallels to today's situation are striking. The dollar remains dominant, but that dominance increasingly depends on American military and political power rather than economic fundamentals. And military power can't support a currency indefinitely when the underlying economy is producing massive deficits. China represents the most serious challenge to dollar dominance because they have both the economic scale and the strategic patience to build alternative systems methodically. The Chinese yuan is already the fourth most used currency in international payments, and China has been systematically expanding its use through trade agreements, currency swap lines, and financial infrastructure development. But China isn't alone. Russia, despite being under massive sanctions, has continued to conduct international trade by bypassing the dollar system entirely. Iran has developed sophisticated methods for selling oil without using dollars. Even European allies are exploring ways to conduct trade that doesn't depend on American financial systems. The acceleration of these trends has been dramatic since 2020. The use of financial sanctions as a foreign policy tool has convinced many countries that depending on the dollar system is strategically risky. When Russian central bank reserves were frozen, every other central bank in the world took note. If it could happen to Russia, it could happen to anyone who disagreed with American foreign policy. This has created what economists call a trust deficit. Countries are still using the dollar system because they have to, but they're actively working to reduce that dependence as quickly as possible. And once alternative systems reach critical mass, the transition away from the dollar could happen rapidly. Let me give you some specific numbers to illustrate how this affects you personally. Right now, when you buy imported goods, part of what you're paying reflects the dollar's privileged status. When other countries have to hold dollars to trade, it keeps demand for dollars artificially high, which keeps the dollar's value artificially strong, which makes imports cheaper for Americans. When that artificial demand disappears, the dollar's value drops, and import prices rise dramatically. We're not talking about small changes. When the British pound lost its reserve status, import prices in Britain rose by hundreds of % over just a few years. Similar patterns occurred in every historical case of reserve currency transition. For Americans, this would mean that anything imported, anything made with imported components, anything priced in global markets would become dramatically more expensive. Energy costs would skyrocket, food costs would explode, consumer goods would become luxury items for many families. But the impact goes beyond just import prices. When the dollar loses its reserve status, the U.S. government faces a funding crisis. Currently, foreign governments and institutions buy about half of all U.S. government debt. They do this partly because they need dollars for trade and reserves. When that need disappears, demand for U.S. debt collapses, forcing the government to either cut spending dramatically or print money to fund itself. Given the political impossibility of cutting spending, money printing becomes inevitable. This creates domestic inflation on top of the import price inflation. The combination can be devastating. Historical examples show that countries losing reserve currency status often experience inflation rates of 50 to 100% annually. Your savings, your retirement accounts, your fixed income investments would lose most of their purchasing power within a few years. A comfortable retirement could become poverty-level existence. A solid middle-class lifestyle could become a struggle for necessities. But here's the crucial point. This outcome isn't inevitable for you personally, even if it's inevitable for the currency system. The key is understanding what assets protect purchasing power during currency transitions and positioning yourself accordingly before the crisis begins. Historical data shows that certain asset classes consistently outperform during currency crises. Physical gold and silver have maintained purchasing power through every major currency collapse in history. Real estate in stable countries has preserved wealth through currency transitions. Stocks and companies with hard assets and international revenues have protected investors from domestic currency debasement. The key is diversification, but not the kind of diversification most financial advisors recommend. You need geographic diversification, currency diversification, and asset diversification that specifically accounts for dollar collapse scenarios. Geographic diversification means owning assets outside the United States that won't be affected by U.S. domestic economic policies. This could include foreign real estate, foreign bank accounts, foreign stocks, or foreign residency options. The goal isn't to abandon America, but to ensure that not all your wealth is tied to American economic performance. Currency diversification means holding assets denominated in currencies other than dollars. This could include foreign currency bank accounts, foreign bonds, or assets that tend to rise when the dollar falls. The goal is to ensure that dollar weakness becomes your strength rather than your weakness. Asset diversification means focusing on assets that maintain value regardless of monetary policy. Physical precious metals, productive real estate, businesses with hard assets, commodities that people need regardless of conditions. These assets protect purchasing power when paper currencies fail. Gold deserves special attention because it has played this protective role throughout history. When the German mark collapsed in the 1920s, Germans who owned gold maintained their purchasing power, while those who held marks lost everything. When the Argentinian peso collapsed repeatedly, Argentinians with gold preserved their wealth while those with pesos were wiped out. Central banks understand this, which is why they've been buying gold at record rates. China has increased its gold reserves dramatically over the past decade. Russia built up massive gold reserves before facing sanctions. Even European central banks that were selling gold 20 years ago are buying it again. But gold isn't the only answer. Foreign real estate in stable countries has provided protection during currency crises. Swiss real estate protected wealth during both world wars and multiple currency crises. Singaporean real estate has preserved purchasing power through various Asian currency crises. Stocks can also provide protection, but only if you choose carefully. Companies with international revenues benefit when the domestic currency weakens because their foreign income becomes worth more. Companies with hard assets like natural resources maintain value because commodities tend to rise during currency crises. The technology sector presents particular challenges during dollar collapse scenarios. Many technology companies have few hard assets and depend on continued capital investment. During currency crises, capital often flees to safety rather than growth, which can devastate technology stock prices. Energy companies, by contrast, often perform well during currency crises because energy demand remains relatively stable, while energy prices typically rise with currency debasement. Mining companies benefit because precious metals and industrial commodities become more valuable. Agricultural companies benefit because food demand is inelastic and agricultural land is a hard asset. International diversification requires understanding not just what to buy, but where to buy it. Some countries have much stronger institutions and property rights than others. Some countries have more stable currencies than others. Some countries offer better protection for foreign investors than others. Switzerland has historically been the safest haven for international wealth because of strong institutions, stable currency policy, and robust protection for foreign investors. Singapore has emerged as an Asian alternative with similar characteristics. But international diversification isn't just for the wealthy. Even modest savers can open foreign bank accounts, buy foreign exchange-traded funds, or invest in international real estate through publicly traded companies. The key is starting before the crisis rather than trying to move money when everyone is panicking. The timeline for these changes is crucial to understand. Currency transitions don't happen overnight, but they also don't take decades. Historical examples suggest that once the transition begins in earnest, most of the change occurs within 5 to 10 years. We're probably already several years into the transition. The signs to watch for include continued decline in dollar holdings by foreign central banks, further expansion of non-dollar trade agreements, successful implementation of BRICS payment systems, and major oil producers accepting non-dollar payments as standard practice. But you can't wait for these signs to become obvious because by then it will be too late to position yourself effectively. Currency crises create capital controls, banking restrictions, and regulatory changes that make it much more difficult to move money internationally or buy protective assets. The psychological barriers to taking action are substantial. Most Americans have never experienced a currency crisis and can't imagine that the dollar could lose its dominant status. The dollar has been strong for their entire lives and it feels permanent. The idea that this could change seems impossible. This normalcy bias is dangerous because currency dominance isn't permanent for any country. The Spanish dollar dominated global trade for centuries before being displaced by the British pound. The British pound dominated for over a century before being displaced by the American dollar. The American dollar has dominated for about 80 years, which is actually longer than most reserve currency periods in history. There's also a patriotic bias that makes it feel disloyal to prepare for dollar weakness. Many Americans feel that protecting themselves from dollar collapse is somehow betting against their own country. But protecting your family's financial future isn't unpatriotic, it's prudent. And it doesn't require hoping for American failure. It just requires acknowledging that monetary systems change and preparing accordingly. The complexity of international investing also deters many people. Opening foreign accounts, understanding foreign tax implications, researching foreign markets feels overwhelming. But the complexity of not preparing is much greater. Learning to navigate international finance while you have time is much easier than trying to figure it out during a crisis when everyone is competing for the same protective assets. Another barrier is the assumption that the U.S. government won't allow the dollar to lose its reserve status. Many Americans believe that American military and economic power will preserve dollar dominance regardless of economic fundamentals. But military power can't force other countries to use a currency that's being debased through excessive money printing. At some point, economic fundamentals matter more than political pressure. The government's response to dollar weakness is likely to make the situation worse for individual Americans rather than better. When currencies come under pressure, governments typically respond with capital controls, restrictions on foreign investment, and increased taxation of international assets. These measures might temporarily slow capital flight, but they trap domestic savers in a depreciating currency system. Understanding this likely government response makes early action even more important. If you wait until the crisis is obvious, you may find that legal options for protecting your wealth have been eliminated or made prohibitively expensive. The time to act is when it still seems unnecessary, not when it becomes obviously essential. The specific strategies you choose depend on your financial situation, your risk tolerance, and your personal circumstances. Someone with $100,000 in savings faces different options than someone with $10 million. Someone planning to retire in America has different needs than someone willing to relocate internationally. But regardless of your situation, some level of protection makes sense. At minimum, every American should own some physical precious metals, some international investments, and some hard assets that would maintain value during currency debasement. The exact allocation depends on your circumstances, but zero allocation to these protective assets is financially reckless given current economic trends. For precious metals, physical ownership is preferable to paper ownership because paper claims can be defaulted on during financial crises. This means coins and bars stored in secure locations rather than ETFs or mining stocks, although those can provide additional exposure. The storage location matters too. Domestic storage is convenient, but potentially subject to government confiscation, while foreign storage is more secure, but less accessible. For international investments, developed markets with stable institutions offer safety, while emerging markets aligned with commodity production offer growth potential during dollar weakness. The BRICS countries themselves might provide opportunities, but they also carry political risks that must be weighed carefully. For real estate, foreign properties in stable countries provide both inflation protection and geographic diversification. But foreign real estate requires understanding local laws, tax implications, and market conditions. Publicly traded international real estate companies can provide similar benefits with greater liquidity and lower transaction costs. The energy and commodity sectors deserve special consideration because they typically benefit from currency weakness and inflation. Companies owning actual resources rather than just trading or processing them offer the strongest protection. Pipeline companies, mining operations, and agricultural land provide more stability than exploration or trading companies. The timeline for implementing these strategies depends on how quickly you can research options, open necessary accounts, and execute transactions. Some changes can be made immediately, like buying precious metals or international ETFs through domestic brokers. Other changes, like opening foreign bank accounts or purchasing foreign real estate, require more time and documentation. The key is starting now, rather than waiting for perfect information or ideal conditions. Currency transitions are unpredictable in their exact timing, but predictable in their general pattern. The longer you wait, the fewer options you'll have, and the higher the prices you'll pay for protective assets. The cost of being wrong about timing is much lower than the cost of being unprepared. If the dollar doesn't collapse as quickly as expected, you'll still own assets that provide diversification and inflation protection. But if the collapse happens faster than expected and you're not prepared, you could lose decades of savings and planning. This isn't about becoming a doomsday prepper or abandoning modern financial markets. This is about prudent portfolio management that accounts for realistic risks based on historical precedent and current economic trends. Every serious investor should have some allocation to assets that protect against currency crisis, just like they have allocations to protect against stock market crashes or inflation. The wealthy already understand this. They've been moving money internationally, buying hard assets, and reducing their dollar concentration for years. Family offices and institutional investors have been quietly implementing these strategies while telling retail investors that everything is fine. You don't have to be wealthy to follow similar strategies, but you do need to start before the crisis becomes obvious to everyone. Once currency collapse becomes front-page news, protective assets become much more expensive and much harder to acquire. The time to buy insurance is before the house catches fire. The dollar's 80-year dominance as the global reserve currency is ending. The question isn't whether this transition will happen, but how quickly it will unfold and whether you'll be positioned to protect your wealth when it does. The BRICS nations, representing over half the world's population, are building alternative financial systems specifically designed to bypass dollar dependence. Central banks are diversifying away from dollar reserves at accelerating rates. The petrodollar system is cracking under geopolitical pressure. When this transition accelerates, Americans who are unprepared will face devastating import inflation, funding crises for government spending, and potential capital controls that trap their wealth in a depreciating currency system. But Americans who position themselves correctly will not only survive, but potentially thrive as the global financial system reorganizes around new power centers. The strategies exist. The precedents are clear. The timeline is compressed. The choice is yours, but the window for preparation is closing rapidly. Don't be the person who recognizes the signs too late and spends the rest of their life wishing they had acted when they had the chance.